This is a deeply personal account of my life, sharing the pain of betrayal and the fallout from a cheating spouse. It's not easy to relive these moments, but as I near 60, I find myself asking, am I crazy to give love another chance? Is it even worth trying again at this age? I've read many heartbreaking stories, some even more devastating than mine, but I feel like my perspective might be a little different. While the betrayal hurt me deeply, time has brought some clarity, and I want to offer a perspective that shows how things can change, for better or worse, over the years. Perhaps there's a glimmer of hope in my story, even after so much pain. This is a long story, but I think the background is important so you can understand how it all unfolded. And from there, you can help me decide, is it foolish to attempt this again? Is 60 too late to rebuild? I met my wife, Laura, over 30 years ago, and we shared nearly a decade together, 7 of which we spent married. We raised 2 wonderful kids, who are now grown and leading lives of their own. Our story started on a blind date, and to be honest, it was pretty awkward. Laura is an outgoing, vivacious woman, full of life and charm. Meanwhile, I've always been more reserved, not the type to command a room or draw attention. I'm decent looking but nowhere near a head-turner. I guess you could say I was the quiet type, always watching from the sidelines while Laura lit up every room she walked into. To my surprise, Laura liked me despite my quiet demeanor, and our relationship grew stronger with time. Eventually, we got married and started to build what I thought was a pretty good life. We had a comfortable home, steady finances, wonderful friends, supportive families, and our kids were thriving. Life was good, or at least it seemed that way for a while. But as many stories go, there's always a turning point that shakes the foundation. For us, that moment came with a 3rd pregnancy. We already had 2 little ones, but we wanted to grow our family further, and soon enough, we found out we were expecting another baby. It felt like everything was falling into place. We waited a few months before sharing the news with our families, and during that time, we were busy preparing the nursery, getting the kids ready for the new addition, and looking into our finances to make sure we were ready. I was over the moon about becoming a father again, and things seemed perfect. But then came the worst day of my life. Laura called me from the hospital, her voice shaking. "Something's wrong with the baby," she said. I rushed to meet her, and it was there that we found out our baby had passed away. Laura had a miscarriage at 6 months. The grief was overwhelming, almost unbearable. When we got home the next day, we were consumed by silence and sadness. Laura shut herself in our bedroom for 3 days straight, barely eating or speaking. She was completely shattered, believing that she had somehow failed me as a wife, even though I tried my best to comfort her. I kept telling her, "It wasn't your fault. We can try again when the time is right." But she wouldn't hear it. She blamed herself, sinking deeper into a depression that lasted for months. It took nearly half a year for her to start feeling like herself again. Slowly, she began to come out of her grief. She was back to being the lively woman I knew and loved, and we began to talk about our future again. She even started working out and getting in shape, looking more amazing every day. I was proud of her and made sure to tell her how incredible she looked. During this time, she decided she wanted a part-time job, not for the money but to get out of the house and be around other adults. I thought it was a great idea and encouraged her to find something she enjoyed. To my surprise, she took a job as a waitress and bartender at a local restaurant. She has a degree in business, but she didn't want to commit to a corporate job because the hours and responsibilities would have been too much for her with our family. Working at the restaurant was more of a way to stay active, contribute to the household, and break out of the isolation she'd been feeling. Laura has always been a beautiful woman, and with her new fitness routine, she was turning heads wherever she went. She never had trouble attracting attention from men, but I trusted her completely. In all the years we'd been together, she'd never given me a reason to doubt her. At first, things at the restaurant seemed fine. She worked 2 or 3 nights a week, usually on weekends. However, I started to notice something that made me uneasy. her outfits. Laura would wear tight, flattering clothing that, while tasteful, showed off her figure more than I was comfortable with. I voiced my concerns, but she just laughed it off, saying, "It helps with the tips. Besides, maybe it'll spark a little more romance between us." The restaurant was owned by a local family, and the father, Mark, was a decent man who ran a good business. But his son, Todd, was another story. Todd was around our age, married, but had no kids. He was the type of guy who oozed arrogance, flashing his wealth and flaunting his good looks like they were the only things that mattered. He wasn't the kind of person I'd want my wife spending a lot of time with, but Laura had to work with him. She told me he was good-looking but insufferable, always showing off and talking about himself. I didn't think much of it at first. Laura complained about him being arrogant, but she said they were just coworkers, and that was that. But then, things started to change. It began with small things. She was more protective of her phone, staying out late, or coming up with excuses to spend more time away from home. She said she had to work late or run errands, but something didn't feel right. She started pulling away from me, too. Our conversations became more distant, and she seemed less interested in spending time with the kids. I could tell something was off, but whenever I brought it up, she would brush me off, saying I was making a big deal out of nothing. Then, one night, everything came crashing down. We were alone in the house, and I made a move to be intimate with her. But she shut me down, cold. I asked her what was wrong, and that's when she broke down in tears, trembling uncontrollably. I had no idea what was coming next. What she told me changed everything. For the past 6 months, Laura had been seeing Todd behind my back. Not only had they developed a close friendship, but their relationship had turned sexual. She admitted she had fallen in love with him, and she was leaving me to move in with him. Just like that. She was done with our marriage, and she had already made up her mind. I was stunned, completely blindsided by her words. It felt like I had been hit by a freight train, my whole world crumbling right in front of me. Laura, the woman I had built my life with, was telling me that not only had she been cheating on me for months, but that she was also in love with this other man. Worse still, she was planning to leave me and our family to start a new life with him. I sat there in disbelief as she told me that our marriage had been over for a while, that she had felt disconnected ever since the miscarriage. She said she needed to feel alive again, and Todd, of all people, was giving her that. As if to twist the knife deeper, she claimed that he understood her in a way I never could. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to scream at her, demand an explanation, or maybe beg her to stay. But another part of me, the part that had seen the warning signs for months, just sat there in silence, trying to process what was happening. I couldn't wrap my head around the fact that the woman I had loved for years was now standing in front of me, saying she was done. Still, I tried to reason with her. I asked her to think about the kids, to reconsider. I told her we could work through it, go to counseling, anything to salvage what we had built together. But her mind was made up. She wasn't just leaving me, she was leaving us. As she packed a few things and left that night, I felt a hollowness inside me that I hadn't known was possible. I watched her drive away, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly alone. The days that followed were a blur. I was devastated, trying to make sense of what had happened while also holding things together for our kids. They didn't understand why their mom wasn't around as much, and I had to figure out how to explain it to them without tearing their world apart like mine had been. Laura moved in with Todd almost immediately, and as much as it hurt, I tried to remain calm and composed, especially in front of the kids. I knew I couldn't afford to fall apart, not when they needed me. But inside, I was a mess. Every time I saw her, every time she came to pick up the kids, it felt like reopening the wound all over again. Todd, for his part, didn't make things any easier. He was still the same arrogant jerk he had always been, parading around with my wife as if he had won some kind of prize. It was infuriating, but I swallowed my pride and focused on being there for my kids. What was worse, though, was that Laura didn't seem to be doing any better with him. It didn't take long before I started hearing about cracks in their relationship. Apparently, Todd wasn't the dream partner she had imagined. He was still the lazy, self-centered guy I had always known him to be, and it seemed like his charm had worn off quickly once they were living together. One night, Laura called me out of the blue. She sounded different, sad, regretful, almost like her old self. She didn't say it directly, but I could tell things weren't going well between her and Todd. She talked about how hard things had been, how she missed the kids, and even hinted at missing me. But I didn't let her draw me in. I couldn't. I told her that I wasn't the one she should be talking to about her problems with Todd, that she needed to figure things out on her own. Still, part of me ached to hear her say those words. A part of me, no matter how much I didn't want to admit it, still loved her. Not long after that call, things took a turn for the worse. Laura had the kids over for a sleepover at her new place with Todd, and everything seemed fine until she called me late that night, in a panic. Todd had been drinking, and in a fit of frustration, he slapped our youngest daughter because she didn't want to watch one of his shows. I was livid. I rushed over to their apartment, my heart racing. When I got there, I could see the mark on my daughter's face, and it took every ounce of restraint not to call the police or do something I would regret. Instead, I gathered the kids and took them home. Before I left, I turned to Todd and said, "If I hear about you putting your hands on my kids again, I'll make sure the next call is to the police." I couldn't help but direct my anger at Laura as well. "This is what you left me for," I said, the words laced with bitterness. She just hung her head, unable to respond. I think that was the first moment she realized the magnitude of the mistake she had made. Later that night, there was a knock on my door. It was Laura, sobbing uncontrollably. She told me she had broken things off with Todd and wanted to come home. I didn't know what to say. A part of me had been waiting for this moment, hoping for it even. But another part of me had changed. I had been hurt too deeply, and I wasn't sure I could ever trust her again. I told her that while I still loved her and always would, I couldn't let her come back. Too much had happened, too much had been broken. She cried harder, and it broke my heart to see her like that. I couldn't let her stay on the street, though, so I helped her call her parents, and I drove her to their house. When we arrived, her father met me at the door. He shook my hand and thanked me for looking after her, even after everything that had happened. He told me I was a good man, and he appreciated what I had done for their family. Those words stayed with me for a long time. Over the next year, Laura stayed with her parents, slowly getting back on her feet. She found a job and eventually moved into her own place. We co-parented as best we could, and things started to settle into a new normal. She was always a good mother, and despite everything, I tried to be civil for the sake of the kids. There were no more fights, no more accusations. Just a quiet, mutual understanding that the past was the past. But every now and then, when we'd see each other at a family event or when she'd come to pick up the kids, I could see the regret in her eyes. She never said it outright, but I knew she wished things had gone differently. And in some strange way, I found solace in that. Maybe I wasn't the perfect husband, but I knew I had been a good one. I had loved her, supported her, and given everything I had to our marriage. Years passed, and while Laura had a few relationships, none of them seemed to last. She once told me, in a moment of vulnerability, that I had been the best relationship she'd ever had, that no one else had ever come close. I didn't know how to feel about that. Part of me wanted to hear it, but another part of me felt like it was too little, too late. As for me, I dated here and there, but I never really allowed myself to get close to anyone. The pain from my marriage still lingered, and I wasn't ready to open myself up to the possibility of being hurt again. I focused on my kids, my work, and tried to move forward as best I could. As the years passed, my kids grew up, went to college, and eventually started lives of their own. I was proud of the way they turned out, despite the turmoil that had shaken our family. They were strong, resilient, and had built successful lives for themselves. In a way, focusing on them helped me keep going, even when I didn't always know where I stood with myself. Throughout all those years, I would still see Laura regularly at family events, weddings, birthdays, graduations. We always kept things civil, but I could tell she was still carrying that weight of regret. Every now and then, she'd ask if I was seeing anyone or if there was a chance for us to be together again. I would always give her the same answer, no. Not because I didn't care about her, I did, more than I liked to admit, but because I was still haunted by the past. There were some wounds that never fully healed. She told me once that her hardest days were not just about the big events but the moments when she realized I was no longer by her side. She said it hit her most painfully at her parents' funerals when she saw me there, offering support but not as her husband, not as her partner in life anymore. She said she had never felt so alone. That admission, though heavy, didn't move me the way it might have years ago. By then, I had learned to live with the reality that the life we once had was over. Still, every time we had these conversations, she would talk about what-ifs. What if she hadn't left me? What if we had stayed together and worked through the pain? What if we had been able to rebuild the life we once had? She even admitted that she'd thought about those questions during the weddings of both of our children, picturing us standing together, proud of the family we had raised. She said it broke her heart to know that she had torn us apart for something that never made her truly happy in the end. By the time we hit our late 50s, I started thinking about the future, about retirement. I had spent my life working hard, raising my kids, and trying to find my own peace. As the prospect of retiring loomed closer, I started to dream about warmer climates and quieter days. Maybe the Carolinas, somewhere where I could escape the cold winters and relax. The last significant conversation I had with Laura before I made that move was at a birthday party for one of our grandchildren. We stepped outside, away from the noise, and she became emotional, more so than I'd seen in years. She said she had always held on to the hope that maybe one day we'd get back together. My decision to move away, she admitted, felt like the end of any possibility of that ever happening. She looked at me, tears in her eyes, and asked if I could ever see us rekindling what we once had. She told me she had been living with regret for so long that it consumed her. She still loved me, and the thought of me leaving, of us never being close again, crushed her. I didn't know what to say. For so long, I had pushed those feelings away, burying them under years of hurt. But there, standing with her, looking into her eyes, those same beautiful green eyes I had fallen in love with all those years ago, I felt something stir inside me. A small part of me had never stopped loving her. As much as I had tried to move on, there was still something between us, a connection that hadn't entirely faded away. She asked if she could visit me when I moved. She didn't push for more than that, just a visit. I told her I would think about it. But in that moment, something shifted in me. I realized that maybe I wasn't as done with the past as I had thought. A few months later, I found myself settled in the Carolinas, enjoying the quiet life I had longed for. And then, Laura came to visit. It was supposed to be a short stay, just a weekend, but somehow, it stretched into 2 weeks, and then a month. It was almost like time had rewound, like we had fallen back into a rhythm that felt familiar, even comforting. We spent those days rediscovering each other, doing simple things, going for walks, cooking meals together, sitting on the porch and talking about everything and nothing. It felt good, better than I had expected. We laughed, we shared memories, and for the first time in a long while, I felt truly at peace. One night, she broke down in tears. She told me how much she regretted what had happened, how she had spent years chasing a dream that turned out to be empty. She said that being with me again, even for those few weeks, had brought her more happiness than she had felt in years. She apologized over and over, saying she had wasted so much time looking for something that wasn't real when everything she ever needed had been right in front of her. I listened to her, letting her pour out her heart, and when she was done, I realized something that had been sitting inside me all along. I still loved her. I had never stopped loving her, not really. Sure, the hurt and the betrayal had buried those feelings for a while, but they had never truly gone away. They had just been waiting, dormant, for the right moment to resurface. That night, I told her the truth, that I had always loved her, and that maybe, just maybe, we still had a chance to write a new chapter in our story. We didn't need to look back and dwell on the past anymore. We could move forward, together. She stayed. In fact, she never left. What started as a short visit became something much more. We told the kids, and though they were shocked, they were happy for us. My youngest daughter, in particular, wasn't too surprised. She said she had always known that my love for her mother had never truly died. Now, as we near 60, I find myself in a place I never expected to be. After all these years, after all the pain, Laura and I have found our way back to each other. Some people might think I'm crazy for giving her another chance after everything that happened, but at this stage of our lives, I'm not sure that matters anymore. What matters is that we've both changed, grown, and learned from the past. Would she cheat again? I honestly don't think so. Not now, not after everything we've been through. But life has taught me that people are complex. We're all flawed, and we all make mistakes. One bad decision doesn't define a person, and I've come to terms with that. Looking back, I sometimes wonder if I should have tried harder to save our marriage all those years ago. Maybe I should have been more understanding, given her more grace. But there's no point in dwelling on the what-ifs. What matters is that we've been given this second chance, and I'm determined to make the most of it. In the end, life is about forgiveness, love, and sometimes, getting a chance to finish the story you thought had ended long ago. With Laura now staying with me, we began building a life together that, for once, didn't feel haunted by the mistakes of the past. It was as if the years of heartache and regret had finally loosened their grip on us. Every morning, we'd wake up and simply enjoy each other's company. We didn't try to force anything, we just let things fall into place naturally. There were moments, of course, when the weight of what had happened still lingered. Sometimes, late at night, Laura would bring up the past, how she had let herself be swept away by something that wasn't real, how she had hurt the people she loved the most. She'd cry, apologize again, and ask how I could possibly forgive her. In those moments, I'd remind her that we were here now, that we couldn't undo what had been done, but we could make the future different. I knew that hanging on to bitterness wouldn't serve us, especially now that we had this second chance. There's something to be said for getting older, for realizing that life doesn't always go the way you planned, but you can still find peace. Laura and I had both been through enough to understand that love, real love, isn't about perfection. It's about standing by each other when things fall apart, when the mistakes pile up, and when the world feels like it's caving in. Over time, we found our rhythm again. We shared meals, traveled to nearby places, and, more importantly, began to share the small moments that truly make up a life. Watching the sun set from the porch, laughing at a silly joke, helping each other with the little tasks that life requires, these were the things I had missed the most. The simplicity of just being together. Our kids, now fully grown and with families of their own, were cautious but supportive. I think they saw how much their mother regretted the choices she had made, and they could tell that I had found some peace in forgiving her. My daughter, who had always been sharp enough to read between the lines, told me one day, "Dad, you've always loved Mom. We all knew it. Maybe you were just waiting for the right time." She was right. I hadn't admitted it to myself for years, but there was always a part of me that held on to that love. It had been buried under layers of hurt, resentment, and self-protection, but it had never disappeared. And now, with the hurt behind us, I allowed myself to feel it fully once again. We didn't talk about marriage. We didn't need to. The labels didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that we were together, and for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful about the future. We were creating a new life, one that wasn't about making up for lost time but about enjoying the time we had left. I often think about how different things could have been if we had taken a different path earlier in life. But then, I remind myself that everything happens for a reason, even if the reason isn't always clear at the time. Maybe Laura and I needed to go through all that pain, all those mistakes, to reach this place of understanding. Maybe without all the struggle, we wouldn't appreciate what we have now. One thing that kept surprising me was how much we still enjoyed each other's company after all these years. It wasn't just that we were comfortable around each other, it was that the spark, the connection we had shared so many years ago, was still there. It had survived, in spite of everything. It felt like a gift we hadn't expected but were grateful for. Life has a way of humbling you, of teaching you lessons whether you're ready for them or not. I think the biggest lesson I've learned is that forgiveness doesn't just heal the person you're forgiving, it heals you, too. Holding on to anger, regret, and bitterness only keeps you trapped in the past. Letting go of that weight, though, it frees you to live in the present. Laura and I have come to a quiet understanding that what we have now is precious. There's no point in questioning whether we deserve this second chance or whether it's too late. Life is too short for that. We've chosen to be happy in the here and now, to enjoy the time we have, and to forgive each other for the ways we've fallen short. As we approach our 60s, I think we both feel a sense of peace that we didn't have in our younger years. We're not chasing after some ideal version of life anymore. We've lived enough to know that perfection doesn't exist. But love, real love, the kind that endures, even after betrayal, even after years of separation, that exists. And it's stronger than we ever could have imagined. Now, some people might think I'm crazy for giving her another chance after all these years. And to be honest, I might have thought the same thing once. But after living through everything we've been through, raising kids, dealing with loss, and facing our own failures, I've come to realize that love is more complicated than most people understand. It's not about never making mistakes, it's about being able to move past them. People often say that relationships are about trust, and they're right. But what they don't always mention is that trust can be rebuilt. It takes time, effort, and a lot of hard conversations, but it's possible. Laura and I are proof of that. We're not pretending that everything is perfect, but we've both made the decision to let go of the past and focus on the future. And for the first time in a long time, the future looks bright. I'm not sure what the next chapter will hold for us. Maybe we'll stay here in the Carolinas, enjoying the quiet life we've built. Maybe we'll travel more, or maybe we'll just keep finding joy in the simple moments, sitting on the porch, watching the world go by, knowing that we've survived the worst and come out stronger on the other side. But I do know one thing, I don't regret letting her back into my life. Not for a second. We're older now, maybe a little wiser, and we understand that love isn't always easy. It's messy, it's complicated, and sometimes it hurts like hell. But it's also worth fighting for. I've come to realize that the story of our marriage wasn't finished when we signed those divorce papers. It was just a pause, a painful chapter that we had to go through to get to where we are now. And now, I'm grateful that we get to finish writing this story together. Would she cheat again? I don't think so. We've both been through too much, learned too many hard lessons, to go down that path again. Besides, we're not the same people we were back then. We've grown, changed, and finally found peace. In the end, what matters most is that we've been given a second chance. A chance to love, to forgive, and to live the rest of our lives without the weight of the past dragging us down. And for that, I'm truly grateful. As the days turned into months, Laura and I settled into our new routine together. It was strange at first, this second chapter of our lives, but it also felt right in a way I hadn't expected. The weight of everything we had been through seemed to lift slowly, and as it did, I realized that we were truly moving forward. Our days were filled with the small joys of life, going for walks by the coast, cooking dinner together, or just sitting on the porch in the evenings, talking about anything and everything. I found myself laughing more, relaxing more, and feeling a sense of contentment that had been missing for a long time. For Laura, I think it was a chance to heal. She had carried so much regret with her for years, and now that we were back together, she was learning how to forgive herself. There were still moments when she would break down, apologizing all over again for the hurt she caused, but I always told her the same thing: we're here now. That's what matters. We didn't talk much about the past anymore. There was no need to. We had both come to terms with what had happened and, in a way, made peace with it. What had once seemed like a betrayal too deep to forgive now felt like a closed chapter, one we had both learned from but didn't need to revisit. That's not to say everything was perfect. There were days when old insecurities would bubble up, when I would find myself wondering if I had made the right choice by letting her back into my life. But those moments were rare, and when they did come, I reminded myself that love, real love, isn't about perfection. It's about choosing each other every day, even after everything falls apart. As we neared our 60th birthdays, something else happened that I hadn't anticipated. I started thinking about the future in a way I hadn't for years. For so long, my focus had been on surviving, on getting through each day without letting the weight of the past crush me. But now, with Laura by my side again, I began to dream about what life could look like for the two of us in the years ahead. We talked about traveling more, maybe even buying a small place on the coast where we could spend our days near the water. It wasn't about grand plans or extravagant goals, it was about finding joy in the simple things, in the quiet moments that we had come to treasure. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Laura turned to me and asked a question that caught me off guard. "Do you ever think about getting married again?" she asked, her voice soft, almost hesitant. I didn't answer right away. I had thought about it, of course, but I wasn't sure if marriage was something we needed anymore. We had been through so much, maybe too much for a piece of paper to change anything. But at the same time, I understood why she was asking. After everything we'd been through, maybe this was her way of wanting to close the loop, to feel like we were truly starting fresh. "I don't know," I said finally. "I mean, does it really matter? We're together now, and that's what counts. Right?" She smiled, her eyes full of understanding. "You're right. It doesn't really matter. I guess I just wanted to know what you thought." The conversation ended there, but it left me thinking. Not about marriage, necessarily, but about how far we had come. A few years ago, I would have never imagined that we'd be sitting here, talking about the future as if the past hadn't nearly destroyed us. It was a testament to how much things had changed, how much we had both grown. As the months passed, our relationship only deepened. We were older now, yes, but in a way, that made everything feel richer. We had been through the fire and come out the other side, scarred but stronger for it. We had learned how to forgive each other, how to let go of the pain, and how to find happiness in the simplest of things. One of the biggest changes was how we interacted with our kids. Our reconciliation had surprised them at first, but now they seemed genuinely happy for us. They could see that we were both in a better place, and I think they were relieved to know that the tension between us was gone. Family gatherings were more relaxed, more joyful, and it felt good to have that sense of wholeness again. Still, there were occasional reminders of the past, moments when the old wounds would resurface. Once, at a family event, someone casually mentioned Todd, Laura's ex, the man she had left me for. I saw the flicker of discomfort in Laura's eyes, and I could feel a brief surge of anger in my chest. But I let it pass. He was a part of our history, but that was all he was, history. He had no place in our future, and I wasn't going to let his shadow hang over us anymore. Laura and I talked about him later that night, and she told me how ashamed she still felt, not just for what she had done to me but for how she had allowed herself to be pulled into a relationship with someone who didn't value her. "I was so lost," she said quietly. "I thought he could make me happy, but it was all just an illusion." I squeezed her hand and looked her in the eye. "You don't have to apologize anymore, Laura. We've both made mistakes. But we're here now, and that's all that matters." From that point on, we made a conscious decision to focus on the present, to stop dwelling on what had happened and to start building a future together. It wasn't always easy, years of pain don't just disappear overnight, but we were both committed to making it work. And that made all the difference. The more time we spent together, the more I realized how much I had missed her. Not just as my wife, but as my best friend. There were things about Laura that no one else understood, little quirks and habits that I had come to love over the years. Being with her again felt like rediscovering parts of myself that I had forgotten existed. In many ways, we were different people now than we had been when we first got married. We were older, yes, but we were also wiser. We understood that life wasn't about chasing after some ideal of happiness. It was about finding peace in the imperfections, in the messy, complicated reality of being human. One day, as we sat together watching the waves roll in, I turned to Laura and said, "You know, I don't think we need to get married again. But I want you to know that I'm with you. For the long haul. Whatever that looks like." She smiled, her eyes full of warmth. That's all I needed to hear. And with that, we settled into the life we had built, a life that wasn't perfect, but one that was real, one that we had fought for. It wasn't always easy, but it was worth it. Every day, we chose each other again, and that was what mattered most. As I look back on everything that has happened, the pain, the betrayal, the years of separation, I realize that forgiveness is what saved us. Not just forgiving each other, but forgiving ourselves. We both made mistakes, but we both also learned how to let go of the past and embrace the future, together. Now, as we grow older, I'm grateful for this second chance. It's not something I take for granted. Life is full of twists and turns, but if there's one thing I've learned, it's that love is worth fighting for. Even after everything falls apart, even after all the mistakes, love can still survive. And sometimes, it's even stronger than it was before. As we head into this next chapter of our lives, I can't say what the future holds. But I do know one thing, whatever comes, we'll face it together. And that's all I could ever ask for. As the years rolled on, the peace we had found together deepened. We settled into a quiet life, free from the complications and chaos that had once torn us apart. I often found myself marveling at how different things were now compared to those darker days. It was as if we had both come to terms with the fact that life doesn't follow a straight path, and sometimes, it takes winding detours before leading us back to where we belong. Our days were simple, but there was a certain beauty in that simplicity. We didn't need grand gestures or fancy plans. Just being with each other was enough. Sometimes we'd spend the afternoons sitting in our small garden, tending to the plants, or just reading side by side in comfortable silence. The quieter moments, the ones filled with the unspoken understanding that comes from years of shared history, were the ones that meant the most. Every so often, one of our kids would drop by with their families. They had their own lives, but they made sure to visit often, and I cherished every minute of it. Watching my grandkids grow up, knowing that they would never have to face the kind of heartbreak that had once torn their parents' lives apart, it gave me a sense of contentment. Life had come full circle in a way I hadn't anticipated. The conversations Laura and I had during those family visits always reminded me of how much we had changed. There was no more tension, no more fear of what was left unsaid. Everything was out in the open, and we had built a life where trust had returned, stronger than ever. The betrayal that had once felt like a life sentence now seemed like a distant memory, something that had happened to different people in a different time. In those moments, I often caught Laura looking at me with a certain softness in her eyes. I knew she was still carrying some of that guilt, even after all this time. But I also knew she had forgiven herself in ways that she hadn't been able to back then. And that made all the difference. She had finally allowed herself to believe that she was worthy of love again, and in doing so, she had given me the gift of her full self, without the shadows of the past looming over us. One night, as we lay in bed, she turned to me and said, "You know, I think about the years we lost. I can't help but wonder sometimes what things would have been like if I hadn't, left." I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her words. It wasn't the first time she had said something like this, but the sadness in her voice still tugged at me. "We can't change the past, Laura," I said gently. "We both made choices. But we're here now, and that's what matters. We've built something good, something solid. We've got this second chance." She nodded, her eyes welling up a little, but there was a smile on her face. "You're right. I'm just so grateful for that. For you." In moments like that, I realized how far we had come. We weren't the same people who had made those mistakes all those years ago. We had learned how to hold on to each other, even when it felt like everything was falling apart. And that was what made this second chance so precious. As time passed, I found myself reflecting on everything we had been through, and I started to see it all with new eyes. The betrayal, the divorce, the years of separation, they were all part of our story, but they didn't define us. They had shaped us, yes, but they hadn't broken us. And now, in the later years of our lives, I was thankful for the chance to write a different ending. Our love had been tested, torn apart, and somehow, it had survived. I never thought I'd be the kind of man to forgive what had happened, let alone welcome her back into my life. But life has a way of surprising you, of showing you that sometimes the things you think are impossible are the very things that will bring you peace in the end. We never did get married again. There was no need for that. We didn't need a piece of paper to validate what we had. We had something much deeper now, a bond that had been rebuilt, not on promises or vows, but on years of shared experiences, both good and bad. And that was more valuable than anything else. As we entered our 60s, I started to think more about what lay ahead for us. Retirement was looming, and we talked about what we wanted to do with the time we had left. We both agreed that we didn't want to spend our days just sitting around. There were still so many things we wanted to see and do, places we hadn't been, experiences we hadn't shared. One day, while sitting on the porch, Laura brought up the idea of traveling cross-country. It was something we had always talked about in our younger days but had never gotten around to. Now, with the kids grown and the weight of our past finally behind us, it felt like the right time. "Let's just do it," she said with a laugh. "We can get an RV, pack up, and go wherever we want. No plans, no schedules. Just us and the open road." I smiled at the thought of it. "You think we're too old for that kind of adventure?" "Too old," she teased. "We've been through much worse. I think we can handle a few months on the road." And just like that, we started planning. It was funny how something so simple could bring such excitement. The idea of waking up in a different place every day, with nothing but each other and the world ahead of us, felt like a gift. We had spent so many years chasing after stability, after the things we thought we needed. Now, it was about enjoying what we had already built. The trip itself was everything we had hoped it would be. We visited national parks, small towns, and everything in between. We took our time, never in a hurry to get anywhere, because for the first time in a long time, there was no rush. We were just two people, deeply in love, making the most of the time we had left. And in those quiet moments, sitting by the campfire or gazing out at the stars, I realized that this was the life I had always wanted. Not the perfect life, but a life full of love, forgiveness, and second chances. A life that had been earned through years of struggle and growth. By the time we returned home, something in both of us had shifted. We were more at peace than we had ever been. We had let go of the past, and the future, while uncertain, no longer felt daunting. It felt like an adventure, one we were ready to face together. As we settle into this final chapter of our lives, I often find myself reflecting on the journey that brought us here. It hasn't been easy, and there were times when I thought we wouldn't make it. But here we are, stronger than ever, not because we were perfect, but because we learned how to forgive each other and ourselves. I don't know what the future holds for us, but I do know one thing: whatever comes, we'll face it together. And that's all I could ever ask for. Love is complicated, messy, and sometimes painful. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that love is also worth fighting for. Even after the worst kind of betrayal, even after years of separation, love can survive. And when it does, it's stronger, more resilient, and more beautiful than ever. As I sit here now, looking back on the life we've lived, I feel nothing but gratitude. Gratitude for the lessons, for the pain, and for the second chance we've been given. We've written the final chapters of our story together, and in the end, that's all that matters. The trip we took across the country wasn't just a journey through towns and national parks, it was a journey back to each other. When we finally returned home, I realized that we had rewritten our story in those miles we'd covered. The old wounds, the cracks in our relationship that had once seemed insurmountable, felt more like distant memories, as if we'd finally closed a chapter that had been left open for far too long. We settled back into our home in the Carolinas with a new sense of peace. I could feel it in the way we spoke to each other, the easy comfort we shared, and even in the quiet moments when words weren't needed. Life had given us a second chance, and we were making the most of it. For the first time in years, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. One day, not long after we had returned, I found myself reflecting on how much time had passed. I was nearing retirement age, officially now, and the idea of slowing down and embracing this new phase of life felt natural. Laura, too, seemed to have found a calm she hadn't had in years. The rushing, the constant need for distraction that had once driven her, had disappeared. Instead, she focused on the here and now, on us. The future was no longer something to be afraid of or anxious about. We had lived through the worst and come out the other side. And as we both neared our 60s, I realized how much I appreciated the simplicity of the life we were living. There was no longer the hustle, no longer the need to prove anything to anyone, especially ourselves. Our days were filled with small pleasures, taking walks on the beach, working on projects around the house, spending time with our grandchildren, and occasionally heading out on a new adventure whenever we felt the itch to travel again. We'd become the couple we had once dreamed of being in our younger years, only now, we were stronger, more aware of what mattered, and much more appreciative of the time we had left. Every so often, we'd talk about the past, but not in the way we used to. It wasn't about rehashing old wounds or digging up pain. Instead, we reflected on how much we had grown, how far we had come, and how those difficult experiences had shaped the people we had become. Laura, in particular, seemed to have finally made peace with the choices she'd made. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, something that had become a bit of a tradition for us, she turned to me and said something that stuck with me. "You know," she began softly, "I spent years thinking about what I lost. About how I ruined everything. But sitting here now, with you, I realize that maybe everything we went through brought us here for a reason. Maybe it wasn't about what we lost, but what we found in the end." I smiled at her, feeling the warmth of her words settle into my chest. "I think you're right," I said, taking her hand in mine. "We wouldn't be who we are without those years. And I don't think we'd appreciate what we have now if we hadn't gone through all of it." There was a peace in that understanding, a deep sense of gratitude for the way life had unfolded, even if it hadn't always been easy. We both knew that the second chance we'd been given wasn't something everyone got. It wasn't something we took for granted. One thing that surprised me, though, was how much I had changed. Years ago, I would have never imagined myself forgiving Laura the way I had. I would have never thought I could move past the betrayal, let alone rebuild a life with her. But here we were, and I found myself grateful for the growth that had come from all the pain. It wasn't just that I had learned to forgive Laura. I had also learned to forgive myself. In the aftermath of our separation, I had carried a lot of anger and resentment, not just toward her, but toward myself for not seeing it coming, for not being able to save our marriage the first time around. But over time, I realized that holding on to that anger wasn't helping anyone. It was only keeping me stuck in the past. Letting go of that bitterness had been one of the hardest things I had ever done, but it was also one of the most freeing. And now, years later, I was reaping the benefits of that decision every single day. I was living in the present, enjoying the life we had built together, and looking forward to the years we had left. There were, of course, moments when I wondered what our lives would have looked like if we hadn't gone through those tough years. Would we have been happier? Would we have avoided all the heartache? Maybe. But then I realized that those experiences had shaped us in ways that made us stronger, more resilient, and more aware of what really mattered. It wasn't just about us anymore, either. Our kids had grown up watching us navigate the challenges of life, and I knew they had learned valuable lessons from our story. They had seen firsthand that people make mistakes, but they also saw that redemption and second chances were possible. They had watched us rebuild our relationship from the ground up, and I like to think that they carried some of those lessons into their own lives. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that the story of our marriage wasn't just about betrayal and forgiveness. It was about resilience. It was about the ability to face life's challenges, even when they seem insurmountable, and find a way through them. As we moved into this next phase of our lives, I felt a deep sense of contentment. Laura and I were happy, truly happy, and that was something I hadn't been sure would ever be possible again. Our love, though tested and shaken, had survived. And not only had it survived, but it had grown stronger. The years of separation, the pain of the past, they no longer defined us. What defined us now was the life we had created together, the quiet moments of joy and the deep bond we shared. We were a team again, just like we had been in those early years of our marriage, only this time we were older, wiser, and more appreciative of the journey we had taken to get here. I think back to the man I was when all of this began, the man who had been so hurt and angry, and I can hardly recognize him. I'm proud of the man I've become, proud of the fact that I was able to open my heart again and give Laura a second chance. And I'm proud of the love we share now, a love that has been tested by fire and come out the other side stronger than ever. In the end, I've realized that life doesn't always go the way you plan. There are twists and turns, heartbreaks and betrayals, but there's also beauty in the unexpected. There's beauty in the way life can surprise you, offering second chances when you least expect them, and showing you that love, even when it's been broken, can be mended. As I look at Laura now, I see the woman I've always loved, the woman I've spent a lifetime with. And I see a future that's bright, full of possibility, and grounded in the deep, unshakable love that we've rebuilt. This is our story, one of betrayal, forgiveness, and ultimately, redemption. It's not the story I expected to tell, but it's one that I'm proud of. We've written it together, through all the highs and lows, and now, as we enter this final chapter of our lives, I'm grateful for every moment. We've earned this happiness, and I wouldn't trade it for anything in the world. As the years continued to pass, I found myself more and more at peace with the life Laura and I had built together. The daily rhythm we'd found, whether it was taking a walk around our small town, enjoying dinners with the family, or quietly sitting on the porch watching the world drift by, was exactly the life I had come to cherish. There was a deep contentment in the simple, the ordinary, and in the shared moments that required no effort, just the comfort of being together. We spent a lot of time reflecting on how far we'd come. There were times when we would reminisce about our younger days, back when life was full of energy and big dreams. I could see in Laura's eyes that sometimes she still carried that burden of regret, but those moments were fewer and farther between. Most days, we lived fully in the present, appreciating the fact that we had been granted this second chance at love and life. Our relationship with our kids continued to grow stronger. I could see in their eyes the relief and happiness they felt seeing their parents not just coexisting, but thriving together again. Family dinners and holidays were easier, lighter, and full of laughter. The tension that had once filled the room was long gone. Our grandchildren became the center of those gatherings, and watching them grow made me even more grateful for the family Laura and I had created, despite the detours along the way. One day, while sitting with Laura on that familiar porch, she brought up a question that had been sitting in the back of my mind for a while too. It wasn't about the past this time, or even about our future plans. Instead, it was about something much deeper, about how we viewed the idea of closure and forgiveness after all these years. "Do you ever think about Todd?" she asked quietly, her voice thoughtful, not sad. "About what happened between us and how much of a mess it was?" I was quiet for a moment, not because I hadn't thought about it, but because I wanted to answer carefully. The truth was, I had thought about him many times over the years, though with less anger than I once had. My initial fury at him for stepping into my life and taking what I thought was mine had long faded. What was left was more of an understanding that people like Todd were often more lost than malicious. I finally said. I used to think about him a lot. About how he wrecked everything, or at least, how it felt like he did. But now, when I think about him, I just feel pity, I guess. I'm not angry anymore. He didn't really take you, Laura. That's not how it works. You were in a different place back then, and so was I. We were both lost in our own ways. He just happened to be the wrong person at the wrong time. She nodded slowly, as if taking in my words and letting them settle. I think that's how I feel too, she said after a while. I don't blame him anymore, not really. I don't even blame myself the way I used to. I just see it as part of the journey. It hurt, and it changed us, but it also brought us here, to this. I can't say I'm glad it happened, but I'm not ashamed of it anymore either. I could see the honesty in her eyes, the relief that came from saying those words out loud. It was as if she had finally let go of the last piece of guilt she had been carrying all these years. I think that's what healing looks like, I said, squeezing her hand. We don't have to forget, but we don't have to hold on to the pain either. It's just part of the story. We sat there in silence for a while, watching the sun dip lower in the sky. I felt a sense of finality, but not in a bad way, more like the closing of a chapter that had lingered too long. We had reached the point where the past no longer held power over us. We were free from it, able to look back without bitterness or sorrow, only acceptance. Over the next few years, that freedom became the foundation of everything we did. Laura and I traveled more, even if it was just small trips around the state. We celebrated milestones with our kids and grandchildren, watched them grow, and found joy in the everyday moments that once might have seemed insignificant. There was no more questioning of, what if, or worrying about, what next. We had learned, after everything, that what mattered most was being present, being together. Laura and I also started talking more about our future, not in terms of plans or dreams but in terms of what we wanted out of the years we had left. It wasn't a morbid conversation, more like a practical one. We both knew that time wasn't on our side the way it once was, and that gave us a sense of urgency, not to rush things, but to enjoy them fully, while we could. I want us to be happy until the end, she said one evening, as we sat watching the grandchildren play in the yard. I don't care what we're doing, or where we are, as long as we're happy. I think we've earned that, I replied, looking at her. We've been through enough. Happiness is something we don't have to chase anymore. It's here, with us. And that was true. We had spent so many years trying to fix things, trying to heal and move on, that it felt like we were finally at a point where we could just live. There was no more fixing to do, no more healing that needed to happen. We had done the work, and now, we were reaping the rewards. As we entered our 70s, that peacefulness only deepened. Our travels became a little more relaxed, our days a little slower, but the bond between us never weakened. If anything, it grew stronger with each passing year. The life we had built, the second chance we had fought so hard for, was still as solid as ever. Our children noticed it too. They would comment on how much calmer, how much happier we seemed. It was as if we had finally found the balance that had eluded us for so long. We were content, and in the end, that was all we had ever wanted. One evening, long after the grandkids had gone to bed, Laura and I sat on that same porch, just like we had done countless times before. She leaned her head on my shoulder and sighed, a sound not of sadness but of peace. You know, she said softly, I never thought we'd get here. I never thought we'd be able to fix what I broke. I kissed the top of her head and smiled. You didn't break it alone, Laura. It takes two people to fall apart, just like it takes two to put things back together. And look at us now, we're more than fixed. We're better. She smiled, and I could see the truth of that reflected in her eyes. We were better. We were stronger. And as we sat there, under the fading light of another day, I realized that this was exactly where I was meant to be. In the end, our story wasn't one of perfect love or fairy tale romance. It was one of real life, messy, complicated, full of mistakes and redemption. It was a story of forgiveness, of second chances, and of finding peace after the storm. And as I sat there with the woman I had loved for most of my life, I knew that we had written the best possible ending to our story. It wasn't about the past anymore. It wasn't about what we had lost or what could have been. It was about what we had gained, each other, a lifetime of love, and the knowledge that no matter what life threw our way, we had survived it all. And that, more than anything, was what mattered. As the years passed, Laura and I found ourselves settling into a rhythm that felt almost like the calm after a long, turbulent storm. The road we had traveled, though winding and rough at times, had brought us to a place of peace. It was a peace we had earned, a peace that came with a deep understanding of each other and of life itself. Our days grew slower, but not in a bad way. There was a certain kind of beauty in the quiet of our mornings together. We'd wake up early, sip coffee on the porch, and watch the world come to life around us. The birds chirping, the soft rustle of the wind through the trees, it was all so simple, and yet, it felt like everything we needed. We didn't need grand plans or big adventures anymore. The joy was in the little things, in the shared moments of silence and in the comfort of each other's presence. Every now and then, one of our kids would visit, bringing their own children, now teenagers, with them. Those visits were always lively, full of laughter and activity. I could see how much they cherished these times with us, and I was grateful that we had built this new chapter of our lives together. I knew that our children had learned so much from watching Laura and me rebuild our relationship. They had seen us fall apart and come back together, and I hoped that the lessons we had learned would stay with them, guiding them in their own relationships. One evening, after the grandkids had gone to bed and the house had settled into that familiar quiet, Laura and I sat on the porch once again, just like we had done for so many years now. The air was cool, and the stars twinkled above us, casting a gentle light over the yard. You ever think about how we got here? Laura asked, her voice soft, her hand resting in mine. All the time, I replied. Sometimes it feels like a dream, like everything we went through is a story that happened to someone else. But then I realize, we're the ones who lived it. She nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. It feels like another lifetime, doesn't it? All that hurt, all that confusion. And now it's just gone. Like it never happened. I wouldn't say it's gone, I said, squeezing her hand gently. But it's not what defines us anymore. It's part of our past, but it doesn't control our future. She looked at me, her green eyes still as striking as the day we met. I'm so glad we found our way back to each other. There were days, back then, when I didn't think it would ever happen. Days when I thought I'd lost you forever. You never really lost me, I said quietly. I think I just needed time to heal, to figure out how to move forward. But deep down, I always knew there was a part of me that still loved you. She smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. I never stopped loving you, either. Even when I thought I was moving on, I was still holding on to you. We sat in that comfortable silence for a while, just letting the weight of her words sink in. There was something powerful about hearing her say that, even after all these years. I had known, on some level, that she still cared for me even during our time apart, but hearing it out loud made it feel more real. As the night wore on, we talked about our future, as we often did now that we were in our 70s. We weren't planning trips or big projects anymore, but we were talking about what mattered most, how we wanted to spend the rest of our days, what we wanted to leave behind for our kids and grandkids, and what we still hope to experience together. "You think we'll still be sitting here in 10 years, watching the stars?" she asked, her voice filled with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. "I think so," I said, feeling a deep sense of calm settle over me. "Maybe we'll be a little slower, a little grayer, but I don't see why not. We've made it this far, haven't we?" She laughed softly. "Yeah, we have. Against all odds, we've made it." That was the truth of it. Against all odds, we had found our way back to each other. Our story could have ended in a much darker way, full of bitterness, resentment, and regret. But instead, we had chosen to forgive, to rebuild, and to love each other again. That was what mattered. That was what made our journey worthwhile. As time continued to pass, I became more aware of the fragility of life. There were days when we both felt the weight of age settling into our bones. Simple tasks that once took minutes now required more effort. But through it all, we remained each other's constant, each other's safe place. The years had taught us that life was unpredictable, but as long as we faced it together, we could handle whatever came our way. One summer, we decided to take another trip, a short one this time, just a few hours up the coast to a quiet little beach town. It wasn't about seeing anything new or checking off any bucket list items. It was about taking the time to be with each other, away from the distractions of home, in a place where we could simply exist. We rented a small cottage by the ocean and spent our days walking along the beach, the sound of the waves providing a backdrop to our conversations. There was a moment, one evening during that trip, that stands out in my mind as a perfect encapsulation of everything we had become. We were sitting on the beach, the sun setting behind us, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Laura leaned her head on my shoulder, her hand in mine, and we just watched the waves roll in, steady and calm. "I think this is it," she said softly. I glanced at her, confused. "What do you mean?" "This feeling," she said, turning to look at me. "This is what I've been searching for all these years. This peace. This love. I spent so long looking for it in all the wrong places, but it was always here, with you." I felt a lump form in my throat, and I blinked back the tears that threatened to fall. "I'm glad you found it," I whispered, pulling her closer. We sat there in silence for a while, watching the waves, knowing that we had found something that not everyone gets to experience, a second chance, not just at love, but at life. In the years that followed, we continued to live in that peace. Our days grew even slower, our routines even simpler, but the love between us never wavered. We knew, without saying it out loud, that we had reached a place of contentment that few people ever find. We had made it through the storms of life, and now we were basking in the calm that followed. As I look back now, at all the years we spent together, both the good and the bad, I realized that our story was never about perfection. It was about resilience, about finding our way back to each other even after everything fell apart. It was about love, in all its messy, complicated forms. And in the end, that's what matters most. Not the mistakes we made or the time we lost, but the love we found, the love we fought for, and the love we held on to until the very end. Because in the end, love is all there is. The years continued to pass, and as Laura and I entered the later stages of our lives, we found ourselves reflecting more and more on the incredible journey we had shared. There was a deep sense of contentment that came with growing old together, a kind of peace that only comes from having faced life's challenges and come out the other side stronger. Our days grew quieter. We no longer needed the excitement or the constant activity that had once filled our lives. Instead, we found joy in the simple moments, the quiet mornings spent sipping coffee on the porch, the long walks down the same familiar streets, the evenings when we'd sit together in the living room, lost in our own thoughts but still deeply connected. I noticed, as time went on, that we had both become more reflective. It was natural, I suppose. When you reach a certain age, you start to look back more often than you look forward. Not out of sadness, but because you realize just how far you've come, how many lives you've touched, and how much life has shaped you. One evening, as we sat together on that same porch where so many of our conversations had taken place, Laura turned to me with a question that had clearly been on her mind for some time. "Do you ever think about how different our lives would have been if none of this had happened?" she asked, her voice quiet, thoughtful. I paused, thinking about her question. Of course, I had thought about it many times over the years. There were countless moments where I had wondered what life would have been like if we had never gone through the betrayal, the separation, the years of heartache. But as I sat there with her, holding her hand in mine, I realized that I wouldn't trade what we had now for anything. I used to, I admitted. There were times when I'd get lost in the what-ifs. But now, I don't think I would change a thing. She looked at me, a bit surprised by my answer. Really? Yeah, I said, nodding. It wasn't easy, and there were times when I wasn't sure we'd ever make it back to this place. But in the end, everything we went through, everything we endured, led us here. And right now, sitting here with you, I can't imagine a better life. Laura's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled, squeezing my hand. I feel the same way, she said. It took me a long time to understand that. For years, I carried so much guilt, so much regret. But now, I realized that all of it, the mistakes, the heartache, was part of our journey. And without it, we might not have found this kind of love. Her words hung in the air, and I knew she was right. We had spent so much time rebuilding, learning to trust again, that the love we had now was deeper, more resilient than it had ever been. It wasn't the kind of love that came easily or without effort. It was the kind of love that had been forged in the fire, tested by time and trials, and had emerged stronger for it. As the months went on, our lives continued in that peaceful, steady rhythm. Our children visited often, bringing with them the energy and joy that filled our home with laughter and warmth. Our grandchildren, now teenagers and young adults, would come and sit with us, listening to our stories about the past, about the lives we had lived before they were born. They were curious, always asking questions about what life had been like back then. I think they appreciated seeing the love Laura and I shared. It was a kind of love that not many people their age understood. It wasn't flashy or romantic in the traditional sense. It was quiet, steady, and unshakable, a love that had endured everything life had thrown at it and still remained strong. One day, as we sat with our eldest granddaughter, she asked a question that took me by surprise. "Grandpa, what's the secret to staying together for so long? I mean, after everything you and Grandma went through, how did you make it work?" I looked at her, her young face full of curiosity and innocence, and smiled. It was a big question, one that didn't have a simple answer. But I thought about it for a moment before responding. "I think the secret is forgiveness," I said slowly. "Not just forgiving each other, but forgiving yourself, too. Life doesn't always go the way you expect. People make mistakes. But if you can find a way to forgive, to let go of the hurt, then you can find a way to move forward. Love isn't about never falling, it's about getting back up and choosing to stay." She seemed to consider this for a moment, her brow furrowing slightly. "But doesn't it hurt?" she asked. "Doesn't it make you scared that it could happen again?" I nodded, understanding her concern. "Yes, it hurts. And yes, there are times when you're scared. But love isn't about avoiding pain. It's about being willing to face it together. Your grandma and I, we've been through a lot. There were times when I wasn't sure we'd make it. But we did, because we both chose to fight for it. We chose each other, even when it was hard." My granddaughter smiled softly, and I could see that my words had resonated with her. She was at that age where love seemed like something that should be easy, but I knew she would face her own challenges in time. I hoped that, when she did, she would remember what I had said. Later that night, after everyone had gone home and the house was quiet once more, Laura and I sat together, reflecting on the conversation. "She's a smart kid," Laura said. "I can see a lot of you in her. I can see a lot of you in her, too, I replied, smiling. She's got your strength. Laura chuckled softly. I'm not sure I'd call it strength. Stubbornness, maybe. Stubbornness can be a kind of strength, I said, leaning over to kiss her on the cheek. It's what got us through, after all. As the years continued to pass, that sense of peace never left us. We grew older, slower, and more content with the life we had built. Our days were filled with the quiet joys that come with a long life well lived. And through it all, we remained each other's constant, each other's anchor. Eventually, time began to take its toll. We were no longer able to do the things we once did, long walks on the beach, spontaneous trips to new places. But that didn't matter. We had already lived a lifetime together, and the memories we had created were enough to fill any quiet moment. As we entered our late 70s, there came a day when Laura's health began to decline. It wasn't sudden, it came gradually, the way age often does. But it became clear that we were entering a new chapter, one that neither of us had wanted to face but knew was inevitable. Laura, always strong and resilient, faced it with grace. We've had a good life, she would say, her voice soft but steady. I'm not afraid. And neither was I. I wasn't afraid, because I knew that we had done everything we could to live our lives fully. We had loved, lost, and found each other again. We had built a life that was full of meaning, of second chances, of forgiveness. There was nothing left unsaid between us, no unfinished business. We had loved each other completely, and that was all that mattered. In her final days, we spent every moment together. I would sit by her side, holding her hand, telling her stories from our past, stories of when we were young, when life was full of promise and adventure. She would smile, her eyes still filled with that same warmth, and we would laugh together, even in the face of the inevitable. On her last day, as the sun was setting outside the window, she turned to me and whispered, "Thank you." "For what?" I asked, my voice thick with emotion. "For loving me," she said, her voice barely audible. "For giving me a second chance. For everything." I kissed her hand, my heart full of love for this woman who had been my companion for most of my life. "I should be thanking you," I whispered. "For coming back. For giving us a second chance." And with that, she closed her eyes, a peaceful smile on her face, and quietly slipped away. In the days that followed, I was overwhelmed with grief, but also with gratitude. I had been given a gift that not everyone gets, the chance to love and be loved again, even after everything had fallen apart. I had been given the chance to finish our story, to write the final chapter of our lives together, and it was a chapter filled with love, forgiveness, and peace. Now, as I sit here, looking out at the same view that we shared for so many years, I realize that our story isn't just one of betrayal and forgiveness. It's a story of resilience, of finding our way back to each other, of choosing love even when it was hard. And in the end, that's all that really matters. Love is worth fighting for. Always. In the weeks following Laura's passing, the world felt strangely quiet. The house, once filled with her laughter and her presence, felt emptier than I had imagined possible. There was an odd stillness, a kind of silence that followed me from room to room. I found myself looking at the chair where she used to sit, the spaces in our home that she had filled with her energy, and realizing just how much of my life had revolved around her. Grief is a strange thing. It hits you in waves, sometimes gently, sometimes crashing down with an intensity you don't expect. Some days, I would feel at peace, knowing that Laura and I had shared a lifetime of love, that she had left this world with no regrets. But other days, the absence of her would overwhelm me. I'd reach for her hand in the middle of the night, forgetting for a moment that she was no longer there. And then the emptiness would settle back in, reminding me that this was the new reality I had to live with. But even in my grief, I found a certain kind of solace. I thought back to the years we'd shared, to the journey we'd taken together, one filled with so many ups and downs, but one that had ultimately led us to a place of peace. Our story wasn't one of endless happiness, but it was one of perseverance, of resilience, and of love that endured, no matter what life threw at us. That's what I held on to during the quiet moments when her absence felt the most profound. As the days passed, I found comfort in our children and grandchildren. They visited often, checking in on me, making sure I wasn't alone for too long. They would sit with me, talking about old memories, about their mother, about the life we had all shared together. And in those moments, I realized that Laura wasn't really gone, not entirely. Her presence lived on in the lives she had touched, in the memories we had created together, and most importantly, in our family. One evening, my eldest daughter came to visit, and as we sat on the porch, watching the sun set in the way Laura and I used to, she turned to me with a soft smile. "Dad," she began, "I've been thinking about Mom a lot lately, about everything she went through. I know she wasn't perfect, and I know you too went through hell and back. But you gave her something not everyone gets, a second chance. I think that's what I'll always remember most about you too." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "It wasn't always easy," I said quietly. "But in the end, I think we both knew that love was worth the fight. That's what kept us together." She smiled, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. "You and Mom, you taught us that love isn't always perfect, but it's worth holding on to. I think about that a lot, especially when I'm going through rough patches in my own marriage. Knowing that you and Mom made it through everything gives me hope." Hearing her say that filled me with a sense of pride. It wasn't just about the fact that Laura and I had found our way back to each other, it was about the legacy we had left for our children. We had shown them that love, even when tested, can survive. We had shown them that forgiveness, though difficult, is possible. And we had given them an example of what it means to truly commit to someone, through the best and worst of times. As the months passed, I began to settle into my new routine. It wasn't the same, of course, but I found ways to keep going. I started spending more time with the grandkids, taking walks along the beach, and occasionally traveling to visit old friends. Life had changed, but it hadn't stopped. And that's what I had to remind myself each day: life goes on, even after loss. One morning, while going through some of Laura's things, I found an old letter she had written to me, tucked away in a drawer. The paper was worn, the ink slightly faded, but it was unmistakably her handwriting. I sat down, unfolding the letter carefully, my heart pounding as I realized what it was. It was a letter she had written to me, sometime after we had reconciled, but she had never given it to me. Maybe she had meant to, or maybe she had decided to keep it for herself, but now, here it was, waiting for me to find. The words on the page were simple, yet they struck me deeply. "My love. I don't know if I'll ever be able to say this out loud, but I need you to know something. Every day I spend with you is a gift I never thought I'd get again. There was a time when I thought I had lost you forever, a time when I thought I had ruined everything between us. But you gave me the greatest gift of all. You gave me a second chance to be the woman you deserved. You gave me a second chance at love. I will spend the rest of my days trying to be worthy of that chance. I love you, more than words can say, and I am so grateful for you, for us, and for this life we've built together." I sat there for a long time, holding the letter in my hands, tears blurring my vision. Even now, after everything, Laura was still finding ways to reach me, to remind me of the love we had shared. That letter was her final gift to me, a reminder that our love had been real, that it had been worth everything we had gone through. And in that moment, I knew that I had no regrets. In the years that followed, I carried that letter with me everywhere I went, tucked safely in my pocket or in my bag, a tangible reminder of Laura's love. It gave me strength when the days felt long and the house felt too quiet. It reminded me that, even though she was gone, the love we had shared was still very much alive. As I grew older, the visits from my children and grandchildren became more frequent. They seemed to sense that I didn't want to be alone for too long, and I appreciated their company more than words could express. We'd spend hours talking about the past, about Laura, about all the things we had learned from her. And in those moments, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the life I had lived. There was one afternoon, not long after my 80th birthday, when I found myself sitting with my youngest grandson. He was still in college, full of energy and excitement for the future, but that day, he seemed more thoughtful than usual. "Grandpa," he said, his voice quiet, "I've been thinking about you and Grandma a lot. I know she's gone, but, do you miss her? I mean, really miss her?" I smiled, understanding the weight behind his question. "I do," I said honestly. "I miss her every day. But I don't miss her in a sad way. I miss her in a way that makes me grateful. Grateful for the time we had together, grateful for the love we shared. It's a different kind of missing, I guess." He nodded, processing my words. "I hope one day I can find that kind of love." "You will," I said, resting my hand on his shoulder. "And when you do, hold on to it. Fight for it. Love is worth fighting for, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." He smiled at that, and we sat together in the fading light, just like I had sat with Laura all those years ago. Life had come full circle in so many ways, and I was at peace with that. In the end, I've come to realize that our lives are a collection of moments, some filled with joy, some with pain, but all of them necessary. The journey Laura and I took was far from perfect, but it was ours, and I wouldn't change a thing about it. I know that my time will come, just as hers did, but I'm not afraid. I know that when it does, I will leave this world knowing that I lived fully, that I loved deeply, and that I was loved in return. And that's all anyone can ask for. As the years continued to drift by, I found myself growing more reflective, as if each passing day carried a weight of wisdom I hadn't expected. I had always known that life was fragile, but it wasn't until Laura passed that I truly understood what it meant to lose someone who had been a part of my very soul for so long. Yet, as much as I missed her, there was also a calmness that settled into my heart, a recognition that we had lived a full life, filled with love, forgiveness, and, most importantly, the second chance we had been given. My children, now middle-aged themselves, were always making sure I wasn't alone for too long. They would call, visit, and sometimes even insist I spend the weekend with them, just to break the routine of my days. I appreciated their efforts more than I could say. But deep down, I had come to terms with the quietness of my life. After years of chasing, rebuilding, and finding my way back to Laura, this stillness wasn't something I feared anymore. It was a companion in its own right. There were moments, though, when the past would come flooding back in unexpected ways. Like the time I found one of Laura's old recipe cards tucked away in a drawer, her handwriting still clear and precise. It was a simple recipe for an apple pie she used to make on special occasions. Seeing it brought a rush of memories, her bustling around the kitchen, the smell of cinnamon filling the air, the way she'd always pretend she wasn't quite sure if it would turn out, even though it was perfect every time. I sat with that recipe card for a while, letting the memories wash over me. It didn't hurt the way it once might have. Instead, it was a reminder of the life we had built together, of the small moments that had made up the foundation of our love. I decided that day to make her apple pie, not because I needed to taste it, but because I wanted to feel connected to her in a small, tangible way. As I stood in the kitchen, mixing the ingredients just the way she had taught me, I realized something important: Laura had never really left. Her presence was still all around me, in the memories we had created, in the love our family shared, and in the lessons we had both learned along the way. She was there in the laughter of our grandchildren, in the stories our children told, and in the quiet strength that had come to define my days. After I finished the pie, I sat down at the kitchen table, the smell of apples and cinnamon filling the room. It wasn't about the pie itself, it was about honoring the life we had shared, the small traditions we had created, and the way those traditions continued, even after she was gone. In the months that followed, I found myself reflecting more and more on the idea of legacy, not in the sense of wealth or material possessions, but in the sense of what we leave behind in the hearts of those we love. Laura and I had built a life that was full of mistakes, sure, but it was also full of resilience and love. We had shown our children and grandchildren that life isn't about perfection, it's about forgiveness, about fighting for what matters, and about finding peace in the journey, no matter how bumpy the road may be. One afternoon, as I was sitting on the porch, a familiar place for my thoughts, my eldest son came to visit. He was in his 50s now, with a family of his own, but that day he looked like the little boy I remembered from all those years ago, the one who had watched his parents go through so much and had come out stronger for it. "Dad," he said, sitting beside me, "I've been thinking a lot about you and Mom lately. About everything you both went through, and how you still found a way to make it work. It's something I think about every time my wife and I hit a rough patch. You showed us that love isn't about having it all figured out. It's about staying." I looked at him, a wave of pride swelling in my chest. "Your mother and I, we didn't always get it right," I said. "But we learned that what matters is choosing each other, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." He nodded, his eyes thoughtful. "You and Mom were the example we needed. Not of perfection, but of commitment. And that's something I'm trying to pass on to my own kids." Hearing him say that was the validation I didn't even know I had been seeking. Laura and I hadn't been perfect, not by a long shot, but we had fought for each other, for our family, and for the life we had built. And now, seeing the strength in my children's marriages, knowing that they had taken those lessons to heart, it was all worth it. Every tear, every argument, every moment of doubt had led to something bigger than ourselves. It had led to a legacy of love that would carry on long after I was gone. As time wore on, I began to feel the weight of age more acutely. My body was slower, my movements more deliberate, but my mind was still sharp, and my heart still full of gratitude for the life I had lived. I spent my days surrounded by family, watching the next generation grow, and finding peace in the knowledge that I had done all I could to live well, to love fully, and to forgive deeply. One afternoon, as I sat on the porch with the gentle breeze blowing through the trees, I felt a familiar calm settle over me. I had come to terms with the fact that my time was nearing its end. There was no fear, no sadness, just a quiet acceptance. I knew that when my time came, I would leave this world with no regrets. I had loved, I had been loved, and I had lived a life that mattered. As I closed my eyes and let the warmth of the sun wash over me, I thought of Laura. I could almost feel her sitting next to me, her hand resting in mine, just like old times. I imagined her smile, her laughter, the way she had always known how to make even the darkest days feel a little bit brighter. And in that moment, I realized that love never really dies. It carries on, in the memories we share, in the lives we touch, and in the small, everyday moments that define our existence. Laura's love was still with me, just as it always had been, and it would stay with me until the very end. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of a lifetime settle into my bones, and smiled to myself. I was ready to join her again, whenever that time came. But for now, I would enjoy these last quiet moments, content in the knowledge that our story, with all its twists and turns, had been a beautiful one. Because in the end, love, true love, doesn't end. It simply changes form, becoming part of the fabric of our lives, woven into the hearts of those we leave behind. And that, I realized, was the legacy Laura and I had created together, a love that endured, a love that was worth fighting for, and a love that would last forever. As time went on, the seasons of my life continued to shift gently. Each passing day felt like another step further from the life I had once known with Laura, and yet, I still carried her with me in everything I did. Her memory lingered in the air, in the house we had shared, in the faces of our children and grandchildren, and even in the smallest details of my daily routine. She had become a constant presence in my heart, a quiet comfort in my solitude. My health, as expected with age, began to decline. There were more doctor's appointments, more time spent resting, and fewer of the long walks I used to enjoy. But I accepted this with the same grace I had learned over the years, knowing that life has a way of slowing down when it's time to reflect. I had come to understand that this part of my journey wasn't about doing more or achieving more, it was about savoring what was left, about finding peace in the slow, gentle rhythm of my days. I spent a lot of time with my family, who made sure that I was never alone for too long. They took turns visiting, bringing me food, sharing stories, and just sitting with me, which was something I appreciated more than they probably realized. My children, now fully grown with families of their own, often told me how much they had learned from me and their mother, lessons about love, resilience, and the importance of forgiveness. They said that they saw the strength of our relationship in their own marriages, and that brought me a quiet sense of pride. One particular afternoon stands out in my mind. My eldest daughter came to visit with her teenage son, my grandson, who had recently started college. He had always been a curious kid, and we had shared many conversations over the years about life, love, and everything in between. But this time, there was a seriousness in his eyes that I hadn't seen before. As we sat on the porch, the familiar spot where so many important conversations had taken place, he asked me a question that struck me deeply. "Grandpa," he began, his voice a little hesitant, "do you think true love is rare? I mean, what you had with Grandma, it seems so special. I don't see a lot of people who have that kind of connection." I looked at him, his young face full of hope and uncertainty, and smiled. It was a question I had asked myself many times over the years, especially in the quiet moments after Laura and I had reconciled. "True love isn't rare," I said slowly, choosing my words carefully. "But it's not something that comes easily, either. What your grandmother and I had, it didn't just happen. We built it, brick by brick, over many years. There were times when it felt fragile, like it could break at any moment. But we kept choosing each other, even when it was hard, even when it seemed impossible." He nodded, clearly thinking about what I had said. "But how do you know when it's real? How do you know when it's worth fighting for?" I paused, remembering the many moments when I had wondered the same thing. There had been times, especially after Laura and I had separated, when I wasn't sure if it was worth fighting for anymore. But looking back, I realized that the answer had always been simple. "You know it's real," I said softly, "when you can't imagine your life without that person. When, despite the pain, despite the mistakes, you still want to be with them. It's real when you're willing to forgive, not just for them, but for yourself. Love is about choosing to stay, even when it's easier to walk away." He was quiet for a moment, absorbing my words. Then he smiled, a small, thoughtful smile. "I hope I find that one day." "You will," I said, patting his shoulder. "And when you do, hold on to it. Fight for it. It won't always be easy, but it will be worth it." As he stood to leave, my daughter hugged me tightly, her eyes full of gratitude. "Thanks, Dad," she whispered. "For everything. You and Mom, you gave us something to believe in." I watched them drive away, feeling a deep sense of peace settle over me. It was moments like that, moments where I could see the impact Laura and I had made on our family, that reminded me just how fortunate I was. We had built a legacy together, one that went far beyond the years we had spent on this earth. It was a legacy of love, of resilience, and of second chances. As the years continued to pass, my health became more fragile. There were more days when I needed help getting around, more visits from doctors, and more time spent resting. But through it all, I never felt alone. My family was always by my side, and in the quiet moments, when the house was empty and the day had grown still, I could feel Laura's presence as clearly as if she were sitting next to me. There was one evening, not long after my 85th birthday, when I felt particularly reflective. The house was quiet, the air cool as I sat by the window, watching the last rays of sunlight fade from the sky. I thought about everything that had brought me to this moment, the years of joy and heartache, the love that had sustained me, and the lessons I had learned along the way. I thought about Laura, about how much she had meant to me, and how deeply she had shaped the man I had become. I thought about the years we had spent apart, and how, even then, my love for her had never truly faded. It had always been there, waiting for the right moment to be rekindled. And when it was, it burned brighter than ever. In that moment, I realized that I was ready. Ready to join her again, whenever that time came. There was no fear, no sadness, only a quiet acceptance that this was the natural course of life. I had lived a long, full life, filled with love and forgiveness, and I had made peace with everything that had happened. As I sat there, feeling the gentle breeze on my face, I closed my eyes and imagined Laura sitting next to me, her hand resting in mine, just as she had done so many times before. I could almost hear her laughter, see the warmth in her eyes, feel the love that had never truly left. And in that moment, I smiled to myself, knowing that when my time came, I would be ready. Ready to leave this world with no regrets, knowing that I had loved fully, forgiven deeply, and lived a life that mattered. I didn't know when that time would be, but I knew one thing for certain: when it came, I would be at peace. Because in the end, love is all there is. And I had been fortunate enough to have lived a life filled with it. The days after my 85th birthday began to blend together in a peaceful haze. I spent my time in the same routines that had come to define my later years: quiet mornings with coffee on the porch, afternoons filled with visits from my children and grandchildren, and evenings spent reflecting on the life I had lived. There was a stillness now, a contentment that settled into my bones. I was no longer in a hurry to do anything or go anywhere. Life had slowed down, and I was grateful for the quiet moments it offered. But as my body grew more tired, I could feel that the time was drawing closer. I knew it in the way I moved slower than before, in the way each day seemed a little heavier than the last. I wasn't afraid, though. In fact, I found a kind of calm in the knowledge that I had lived a full life, one that had been rich with love, forgiveness, and redemption. My family, always attentive, seemed to sense this shift too. They visited more frequently, their time with me filled with gentle conversations and moments of reflection. My children would often ask me to tell stories from my past, stories about my youth, about my life with Laura, and about the lessons I had learned along the way. I could see that they were holding on to these stories, as if they were gathering pieces of me to carry with them when I was gone. One afternoon, as I sat with my youngest daughter, we talked about her mother, as we often did. There was something different in her tone that day, though, a quiet understanding that hadn't been there before. "Dad," she said softly, "I think about you and Mom all the time. About how you went through so much and still found a way back to each other. It's something I carry with me, especially when life gets hard." I smiled at her, feeling the familiar warmth of pride. "We were lucky," I said. "Not everyone gets a second chance like we did. But we fought for it. And I think that's the key. Love isn't about avoiding mistakes, it's about being willing to fight for what matters." She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I'm so glad you and Mom had that second chance. I can't imagine what life would have been like if you hadn't." I squeezed her hand gently, knowing how much my story with Laura had shaped my children's view of love and commitment. It was a legacy that went beyond just the two of us. It was something we had passed on, something that would carry on long after we were both gone. As my health continued to decline, I found myself spending more time resting. My body, once strong, was now frail, but my mind remained sharp. I would lie in bed, looking out the window at the world I had known for so long, and think about the moments that had defined my life. The love I had shared with Laura, the family we had built together, and the way we had navigated the storms that had threatened to tear us apart. There was one evening, not long after the new year, when I felt particularly reflective. My children had all visited earlier in the day, filling the house with laughter and warmth. As they left, I had hugged each of them a little tighter, knowing that these moments were becoming more precious. After they had gone, I sat in my chair by the window, watching the sun set, and I found myself thinking back to the early days of my marriage with Laura. I remembered the excitement, the hope, the way we had dreamed of building a life together. We hadn't known, back then, how difficult the road ahead would be. We hadn't known how much we would hurt each other, or how much we would have to fight to rebuild what had been broken. But we had done it, and that was what mattered. As the light outside began to fade, I felt a deep sense of peace settle over me. I closed my eyes, letting the memories wash over me, the laughter, the tears, the joy, the heartbreak. It was all part of the same story, the story of my life with Laura, a story that had been more beautiful than I could have ever imagined. I don't know how long I sat there, but at some point, I felt a presence beside me. It was familiar, comforting, like a soft whisper of the past. I didn't need to open my eyes to know who it was. I could feel her there, sitting next to me, just as she had so many times before. "Laura," I whispered, a smile spreading across my face. "You're here." In that moment, I felt a warmth wash over me, a sense of calm that went deeper than anything I had ever known. It was as if all the years of pain, all the years of separation and heartache, had melted away, leaving only the love we had shared. I didn't need to see her to know that she was there, waiting for me, ready to guide me to whatever came next. For the first time in a long while, I felt completely at peace. The next few days passed quietly. My children continued to visit, bringing with them the same love and warmth that had always defined our family. And then, one morning, I woke up and knew it was time. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft glow through the window. I could feel my body growing weaker, but there was no fear, only a sense of calm. I lay there, watching the light dance across the room, and I knew that I was ready. My eldest son came to sit with me that morning, his hand resting gently on mine. We didn't speak much, we didn't need to. He knew, just as I did, that my time was drawing to a close. But there was no sadness in his eyes, only love, only the quiet understanding that we had shared a life well lived. As the hours passed, I felt the world growing softer around me, the edges blurring as I drifted in and out of sleep. I could feel Laura's presence beside me again, her hand in mine, just as it had been so many times before. And in that moment, I knew that I was ready to let go. The last thing I remember is the soft sound of her voice, whispering my name, and the warmth of her hand holding mine. And then, there was nothing but peace. When the news of my passing reached my family, there were, of course, tears. There was grief. But there was also a deep sense of gratitude for the life I had lived, for the love I had shared with Laura, and for the legacy we had built together. My children, my grandchildren, and even their children would carry on the lessons we had taught them, the lessons of forgiveness, resilience, and the importance of love. At my funeral, there were stories shared, stories of the life I had lived, of the love I had for my family, and of the quiet strength that had guided me through my years. But there was one story that stood out, told by my youngest granddaughter. She stood before the crowd, holding a letter I had written to her years before, a letter in which I had shared some of the lessons I had learned in my long life. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were filled with tears as she read aloud. My grandfather once told me that love isn't about never making mistakes. It's about being willing to forgive, to fight for what matters, and to choose each other, every day, even when it's hard. He and my grandmother were living proof of that. Their love was real, it was messy, it was complicated, but it was also beautiful. And in the end, that's what I'll carry with me. The knowledge that love is worth fighting for. Always. There was a quiet stillness in the room as she finished reading, and I knew that my story, our story, had left an impact. It wasn't about perfection, it was about resilience. It was about forgiveness. It was about love. As my family laid me to rest beside Laura, I knew that I had lived a life filled with purpose, with meaning, and with love that had transcended all the trials we had faced. And now, finally, I was at peace, reunited with the woman who had been my constant, my love, and my companion through it all. In the end, it wasn't about how we fell apart. It was about how we came back together, stronger, more in love, and more grateful for the second chance we had been given. Because love, in its truest form, endures. And in the quiet of eternity, Laura and I would continue our story, together again, just as we had always been meant to be. After my passing, the legacy of my life and my love with Laura carried on in the hearts of my family. As they gathered together, not just to mourn but to celebrate, there was an undeniable warmth that filled the room, a recognition of what truly mattered. Our story, full of twists and turns, had left its mark. It had become a part of them, a guiding light in their own lives. Over time, my children found comfort in the knowledge that Laura and I had ended our journey together in peace. They often told each other stories about their parents' love, their own versions of the moments they had witnessed, the lessons they had learned, and the memories they would carry forward. I could see them in my mind's eye, gathered in someone's living room or around the dinner table, passing down those stories to their children and grandchildren. They would tell them how their grandparents had once been separated, how they had nearly lost each other, but had found a way to come back, stronger and more in love than before. They would talk about how that love, though far from perfect, was what had defined their lives. As the years passed, my great-grandchildren, too, would hear about the love that had brought our family through its most difficult times. My name, and Laura's, would come up in conversations as they grew older, a symbol of something enduring and real. And while the details of our struggles might fade with time, the lessons we had imparted would remain. They would know that love wasn't something to take for granted, but something to be fought for, nurtured, and cherished. One day, years after I was gone, one of my great-grandchildren would ask her mother about the picture on the mantel, a photograph of Laura and me, taken long before we'd grown old, smiling at each other in a way that only two people who had been through everything together could. "Who's that?" she would ask, her small finger pointing toward the framed image. "That's your great-grandma and great-grandpa," her mother would reply, a smile touching her lips as she glanced at the picture. They loved each other very much. The child, curious as always, would wrinkle her nose and ask, what happened to them? And her mother would tell her, in the simplest way possible, the story of how her great-grandparents had loved each other for many, many years. She'd explain how their love wasn't perfect, how they had faced tough times, but that they had always found their way back to each other. She'd tell her daughter how they had built a family based on that love, and how even after they were gone, that love lived on in all of them. But how did they stay in love for so long, the little girl would ask, her bright eyes wide with wonder. And her mother, pausing for a moment, would respond, because they never gave up on each other. Even when things got really hard, they knew they belonged together. That photograph, faded with time but filled with the quiet strength of a love that had endured, would remain on the mantel, a symbol of everything Laura and I had shared. It would remind my family, generations after we were gone, that love isn't always easy, but it is always worth fighting for. That love, real love, requires patience, forgiveness, and a willingness to choose each other, day after day. In the years that followed my passing, my children and grandchildren would carry on our traditions, sharing stories at family gatherings about the times Laura and I had laughed together, cried together, and built the life that had given them their foundation. They would tell the next generation about the time we had spent on our porch, watching the sun set, finding peace in the quiet moments after so much turmoil. They would talk about the love letters they had found, the letters Laura and I had written to each other, hidden away in drawers and boxes. They would read them aloud at family gatherings, marveling at the words that had once seemed so personal, now offering a glimpse into the depth of our connection. And every time they gathered, every time they shared these stories, our legacy would grow a little stronger. We would live on, not just in their memories but in the lessons we had taught them, lessons about love, forgiveness, and the importance of never giving up on the people who matter most. As the years turned into decades, my great-grandchildren would grow older, and their own children would one day ask about the couple in the photograph. The story would be told again, passed down like an heirloom, reminding each new generation that love is a choice, and that the most meaningful relationships are the ones that survive the storms. Even as time continued its slow march forward, even as the details of our lives faded into the background of history, the essence of what Laura and I had shared would remain. Our love had become a part of something bigger, a part of the fabric of our family's story, woven into the lives of those who had come after us. And so, in a way, we never truly left. Our love, though no longer bound by the physical world, would continue to inspire, to comfort, and to guide. It would be there in the moments when our descendants faced their own challenges, when they found themselves questioning whether love was worth the effort, worth the pain. They would think of us, of the way we had fought to stay together, and they would find the strength to fight for their own relationships, their own families. In the quiet of eternity, Laura and I would watch over them, our hands intertwined, as we had always been meant to be. We had lived a full life together, and now, in this place beyond time, we were at peace, knowing that the love we had shared had left a mark on the world, a mark that would endure long after we were gone. Because in the end, love isn't about the years you spend together, or the things you accomplish. It's about the way you make people feel, the way you touch their lives, and the way your love lives on in the hearts of those who come after you. And so, our story continues. Not in the pages of a book, or in the fading memories of an old man, but in the lives of the people we loved, in the choices they make, and in the love they share with the world. Because love, in its truest form, never dies. It simply changes, becoming part of something larger, something eternal. And that is the greatest legacy of all. The years after my passing drifted on, and with them, my story and Laura's remained an integral part of the family. As generations came and went, our story of love, redemption, and second chances became not just a memory but a moral compass for those who followed. It wasn't something spoken about every day, but it was always there, in the background, influencing the decisions my family made and the way they chose to live their lives. My children and grandchildren continued to live out the lessons we had instilled in them, lessons about resilience, forgiveness, and the importance of holding on to love, even when it was hard. They faced their own challenges, of course, but there was a strength in them that I like to think had been passed down through the generations, a quiet courage that had been born from the love Laura and I had shared. As time went on, my great-grandchildren grew into adults themselves, and the stories of their great-grandparents became more than just family history, they became a symbol of something greater. They knew that life wasn't perfect, that love could be messy, but they also knew that it was possible to overcome even the greatest challenges. They carried that knowledge with them, a legacy of hope and perseverance that Laura and I had left behind. There came a day, many years after my passing, when my eldest great-granddaughter, now grown and with a family of her own, decided to gather the family together for a special occasion. It was the anniversary of my wedding to Laura, though neither of us were there to celebrate it. She had heard so many stories about us over the years, had grown up hearing about the love we had shared, and wanted to honor that love in a way that would bring the whole family together. It was a bright, sunny day when they all gathered at the family home, the same house where Laura and I had spent so many years together, the same porch where we had shared countless sunsets. The house had been passed down through the generations, and though it had been renovated and updated, it still held the essence of the life we had built there. As the family gathered, sitting in the yard and reminiscing, my great-granddaughter stood up to say a few words. She was nervous, her voice trembling slightly, but there was a determination in her eyes, a determination to honor the love that had made her own life possible. "I've heard so many stories about my great-grandparents," she began, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "Stories about their love, about the challenges they faced, and about how they found their way back to each other, even when it seemed impossible. I've always admired them, not because their love was perfect, but because it was real. They weren't afraid to fight for each other, and that's something I think we can all learn from." She paused, glancing around at the faces of her family, some of whom had never met me or Laura but had heard our story countless times. "Today, we're here to celebrate the love that brought us all together. Without them, none of us would be here. And while they may not be with us in person anymore, their love is still very much alive. It's in all of us. It's in the way we treat each other, the way we forgive, and the way we hold on to what matters most." There were tears in the eyes of many as she spoke, her words resonating deeply with everyone present. For a moment it was as if Laura and I were there with them, sitting on that same porch, watching over our family as they celebrated the legacy of love we had left behind. After her speech, the family shared stories, laughing and crying as they remembered the moments that had defined our lives. They talked about the apple pies Laura used to make, about the long walks we'd taken together, and about the quiet strength that had carried us through the hardest times. They passed around old photographs, many of which had become worn and faded with age, but still captured the essence of who we were and the life we had lived. As the evening wore on and the sun began to set, the family gathered on the porch, just as Laura and I had done so many times before. They sat together, watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink, and in the silence that followed, there was a sense of peace, a recognition that love, in its truest form, never fades. It endures. I watched from wherever I was, feeling a deep sense of pride and gratitude. The love Laura and I had shared had survived, not just in memory, but in the way our family lived their lives. It was a love that had been tested, broken, and rebuilt, but it had endured. And in the end, that was all that mattered. As the family continued to grow, new generations were born, and the stories of my life with Laura continued to be passed down. There was something comforting about knowing that our love had become a part of something larger than ourselves, something that would continue to inspire long after we were gone. My great-great-grandchildren would one day hear about us, about the way we had fought to stay together, and about the lessons we had learned along the way. They would hear about the apple pies, the walks, the sunsets, and the way we had always found our way back to each other, no matter how difficult the journey. And they, too, would carry those lessons with them, passing them down to their own children and grandchildren, until our story became more than just a part of family lore, it became a symbol of what it means to truly love, to forgive, and to endure. As I watched over them, I knew that our story had come full circle. Laura and I had lived a life filled with challenges, with heartbreak, but also with joy, laughter, and above all, love. And now, that love would continue to guide our family, generation after generation, reminding them that no matter what life throws their way, love is always worth fighting for. In the end, it wasn't the grand gestures or the big moments that defined our love. It was the small, everyday things, the quiet mornings, the long walks, the moments of forgiveness, that had made all the difference. It was the choice, day after day, to love each other, even when it was hard. And that was the legacy we had left behind. Because love, in its truest form, never dies. It becomes part of something bigger, something eternal, something that lives on in the hearts of those we leave behind. And that, I realized, was the greatest gift Laura and I had ever given. A legacy of love that would endure forever. As the years passed and our family's story grew with each generation, Laura and I remained a quiet but ever-present influence. Our great-grandchildren grew into adults, each with families of their own, and though they had never met us in person, they carried us in their hearts through the stories passed down by their parents and grandparents. It became a family tradition to gather every year on the anniversary of our wedding. The family would come together, as large as it had become, to celebrate not only the love that had started it all but also the enduring lessons that had guided them through their own lives. It was more than just a remembrance, it was a chance to reconnect, to be reminded of the roots from which their family had grown. On one such anniversary, many decades after Laura and I had both passed, the gathering was held at the same house that had belonged to us for so many years. The home had been kept in the family, passed down through the generations, and it remained a place of warmth and love. The porch, where Laura and I had shared so many moments of quiet reflection, was now a favorite spot for our descendants to gather, just as we once had. The family had grown considerably, with new faces and children running through the yard, their laughter filling the air. But no matter how much time had passed or how many generations had come and gone, there was always a moment when everyone would gather to talk about the legacy Laura and I had left behind. That year, it was my great-great-grandson who stood before the family. He was a young man, full of life and enthusiasm, and though he had never met me or Laura, he spoke with the conviction of someone who understood the depth of our story. I've heard these stories about great-grandma Laura and great-grandpa for as long as I can remember, he began, his voice clear and confident. I've heard about how they built this family, how they faced challenges, and how they found their way back to each other after so much had gone wrong. But what strikes me most about their story is the idea that love is something you have to choose, again and again. He paused, looking around at the faces of his family, many of whom were nodding in agreement. We live in a world where people are quick to give up on each other. We're taught that if something doesn't go right, you move on, you find something easier. But that's not what great-grandma and great-grandpa did. They didn't choose the easy path. They chose each other, even when it was hard, even when it seemed impossible. And because of that choice, we're all here today. The family listened in rapt attention, knowing that he was right. Our story had always been a reminder that love isn't about perfection, it's about persistence. It's about staying when it's easier to leave, about forgiving when you'd rather hold on to the hurt, and about choosing love every single day. He continued, his voice growing softer, more thoughtful. I've been thinking a lot about the kind of legacy we want to leave behind. And I think the best thing we can do, the way we can honor their memory, is to live our lives the way they lived theirs. With love, with forgiveness, and with the courage to keep choosing the people we care about, even when it's hard. There were tears in the eyes of many as he spoke, not out of sadness but out of a deep understanding that our story, my story and Laura's, had become more than just a part of family history. It had become a way of life. After his speech, the family gathered on the porch, just as they always did. They sat together, watching the sun dip below the horizon, and for a moment, it was as if time stood still. They didn't need to say anything, they all knew what this moment meant. It was a reminder that, no matter how many years had passed, the love that had started this family was still very much alive. In the quiet of that evening, I felt Laura's presence beside me, just as I always had. We watched together, as we had done so many times before, as our family continued to grow, thrive, and carry on the legacy we had left behind. It wasn't about the big moments or the grand gestures. It wasn't about the perfect love story that people so often chase. It was about the choice to love each other through the messiness of life, through the mistakes, the heartbreaks, and the challenges. It was about the quiet moments of forgiveness, the small acts of kindness, and the decision to stay when it would have been easier to walk away. That was the legacy we had left behind, and it was one that would endure for generations to come. As the years continued to pass, our family grew larger, and the stories of our love, of our second chance, became woven into the fabric of who they were. It wasn't just about remembering us, it was about carrying forward the lessons we had learned. And as each new generation faced their own challenges, they would think back to the story of their great-great-grandparents who had once found themselves broken but had chosen to rebuild, together. They would think of the porch where Laura and I had sat, watching the sun set, and they would remember that love, real love, is something you fight for. It's something you choose. And as they carried that knowledge with them, our story would continue to live on, not just as a memory but as a guiding light for those who came after us. In the quiet moments of eternity, Laura and I watched over them, our hands intertwined, just as they had been for so many years. We had lived a full life together, and now, in this place beyond time, we were at peace, knowing that the love we had shared had become part of something eternal, something that would never fade. Because in the end, love isn't about how long you live or how perfect your story is. It's about how deeply you love, how fiercely you fight for each other, and how you continue to choose love, every single day. And that, I realized, was the greatest legacy of all. As time continued its unrelenting march, the family that Laura and I had started kept growing, expanding into something bigger than we could have ever imagined. Year after year, they gathered in the same house, celebrating love, family, and the enduring bond that tied us all together. The house had become a symbol of resilience, a place where generations could come together, reflect on the past, and plan for the future. One year, on the anniversary of our wedding, something happened that felt different. My great-great-grandson, Ethan, a young man in his 20s, was standing on the porch, gazing out at the sunset much like Laura and I had done so many times before. He had grown up hearing the stories of us, of the love that had built this family, but something about the weight of those stories seemed to hit him harder this time. The family was gathered inside, sharing laughter and stories, but Ethan seemed lost in thought. He had been going through a rough patch in his personal life, struggling with relationships that seemed too complicated and unsure of what love truly meant in a world that felt increasingly unpredictable. As he stood there, watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink, he wondered if the kind of love he had heard about, our love, was even possible anymore. He was thinking about leaving the family gathering early, feeling overwhelmed by the weight of his own uncertainties, when his grandmother, my granddaughter, joined him on the porch. She could sense the tension in him, the way he was looking out at the horizon as if searching for answers that seemed just out of reach. Thinking about something heavy, she asked, her voice soft but knowing. Ethan glanced over at her and nodded. Yeah. I guess so. She smiled, the kind of smile that came from having lived through her own ups and downs, her own heartaches. You know, your great-great-grandparents sat here, right on this porch, so many times, watching the same sunset you're watching now. They didn't always have the answers, either. Ethan turned to her, surprised. Really? But they're always talked about like they had it all figured out. Like they knew what love was supposed to be. She chuckled softly. That's the thing about stories, they tend to highlight the good parts and gloss over the hard ones. But the truth is, they didn't always have it figured out. Far from it. They went through things that could have broken them. And, for a while, it did. Ethan nodded, knowing the general outline of our story but never truly grasping the depth of it until now. But they got back together. They made it work. They did, his grandmother agreed. But it wasn't easy. I think the most important thing they ever did was to choose each other, even when everything felt broken. They forgave each other, but they also forgave themselves. They learned that love isn't just about the good times. It's about what you do when everything falls apart. Ethan was quiet for a moment, processing her words. But what if I don't know if I can do that? What if I don't know how to fix things? His grandmother placed a hand on his shoulder, her voice gentle. No one ever knows for sure. But what your great-great-grandparents taught us is that love isn't about being perfect. It's about choosing to stay, even when it's messy, even when you don't have all the answers. Ethan looked down, feeling the weight of those words settle into him. Do you think they would have done it all the same way, if they had the chance? His grandmother smiled, her eyes soft with memory. I think they would. I think they understood that the hard times made the good ones that much sweeter. They fought for each other because they knew that love was worth it. And because of that, we're all here. You're here. Ethan looked back out at the sunset, feeling something shift inside him. It wasn't a sudden clarity, not an answer to all of his questions, but a quiet understanding that love, real love, was something worth fighting for. Something worth choosing, again and again, even when it was hard. Thanks, Grandma, he said quietly, his voice filled with gratitude. She patted his shoulder gently. You'll figure it out. We all do, eventually. Just remember that you don't have to have all the answers right now. Ethan nodded, and together they stood in silence, watching the last rays of sunlight disappear over the horizon. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace, a realization that he didn't need to have everything figured out in this moment. Love, like life, was a journey. And it was okay not to have all the answers. The family gathered inside, laughing and telling stories, as they always did. But this time, something felt different. There was a quiet understanding among them, a recognition that the love that had built this family wasn't perfect, but it was real. It had been tested, broken, and rebuilt, and it had endured because of the choices that had been made, time and time again. As the evening wore on, the family began to trickle out, each member saying their goodbyes and promising to gather again soon. But before everyone left, they gathered on the porch, as had become tradition, to take in one last look at the sky, now dark but peaceful. It was a moment that brought them all together, reminding them of the past, of the love that had created this family, and of the legacy that they were all a part of. As Ethan stood there, looking out at the stars, he felt something shift inside him, a sense of hope, a sense of possibility. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure: he was part of something bigger, something enduring. And that was enough for now. The family lingered for a while longer, not wanting the evening to end, but eventually, they all made their way home, leaving the old house in peaceful quiet. And in that quiet, I could feel Laura beside me, just as I always had. We had watched over our family for so long, and now, as they continued to live their lives, I knew that they would carry on the lessons we had learned. The lessons about love, about forgiveness, and about the importance of choosing each other, no matter what. Laura smiled at me, her hand resting in mine, as we watched them go. "They'll be okay," she said softly, her voice filled with warmth and certainty. I nodded, feeling the truth of her words. Yes, they will. We had lived our lives together, and we had passed on something that would endure far beyond us. Our love, though no longer bound by the physical world, had become something eternal. It lived on in our family, in the choices they made, and in the love they shared with each other. And as Laura and I sat there, watching the stars twinkle above the house we had once called home, I knew that our story wasn't over. It was being written, every day, by the people we had loved and the family we had created. Because love, real love, never truly ends. It carries on, generation after generation, weaving its way into the hearts of those who come after us. And that, I realized, was the true continuation of our story. The love that we had fought for, the love that had endured, was still growing, still evolving, still shaping the lives of those we had left behind. In the quiet of eternity, Laura and I would always be there, watching, guiding, and loving, as our story continued to unfold.